The year was 1956. 3 years had passed since the night Yelena Morozova watched her son taken away. Stalin was dead now. His portraits were still everywhere, on walls, on coins, in classrooms, but his eyes no longer ruled the country. Moscow was changing, slowly, quietly, like ice melting in spring. People spoke a little more freely, though still looking over their shoulders. The newspapers spoke of rehabilitation, of errors in the past. For Yelena, none of it mattered. Every morning she still boiled one extra cup of tea, one for her absent son. Every night she still prayed in whispers no one would hear. Then one morning, as she was mending an old coat by the window, there was a knock. Not the harsh pounding she had feared for years. Just a single quiet knock. When she opened the door, a postman stood there, holding an envelope. "For you, Comrade Morozova," he said. Her hands trembled as she took it. The seal was official, Ministry of Internal Affairs. She sat at the table for a long time before she opened it. The sound of paper tearing seemed to echo through the empty room. The letter was brief, cold. It said her son, Alexei Ivanovich Morozov, had been reevaluated. That his case was under review for rehabilitation. And that if alive, he might soon be transferred for reassessment. Those words, "if alive," burned through her like a knife. She folded the letter carefully, placed it beside his old photograph, and whispered, "Please let it be true." Weeks passed, then months. And then one spring morning, as the city thawed under the first real sun in years, another letter came, this one handwritten, the ink uneven, the edges worn. She knew the handwriting instantly. It was Alexei. "Mama, they tell us some of us may return. I do not know if I will be one of them. I do not ask for forgiveness. I have already forgiven you. You did what you thought would save me. If I come home, I will not speak of the camp. I will not speak of the past. I only wish to see you again. Your son, Alexei." Her knees gave out as she read it. She pressed the paper to her lips, sobbing, whispering his name again and again. He was alive. After all these years, he was alive. From that moment, every sound outside made her heart leap. Every footstep on the stairs made her look to the door. Days turned to weeks again. And then one gray afternoon, she heard a familiar voice outside. Low, soft, hesitant. When she opened the door, he was standing there. Older, thinner, his eyes sunken but still gentle, his once black hair now streaked with white. He wore a plain worker's coat too big for him and held his hat against his chest. For a moment, neither spoke. Time itself seemed to stop. Then he whispered, "Mama." She broke. She threw her arms around him, weeping into his shoulder, her body trembling with every breath. He held her tight, gently, carefully, as if afraid she might vanish if he squeezed too hard. Inside, they sat by the same table where she had once written the letter that destroyed their lives. But now between them there was silence, heavy and fragile. She poured tea, though her hands wouldn't stop shaking. He smiled faintly, trying to hide his pain. She noticed the scars on his wrists, the way he flinched every time the kettle hissed. He looked around the room, the same wallpaper, the same faded curtains, the same clock ticking slowly on the wall. It was as if time had stood still here, waiting for him to come back. Finally she spoke. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said softly. "I thought they would only warn you. I thought it would keep you safe." He nodded slowly. "I know." They didn't say more. There was nothing left to explain. That night, after she fell asleep in her chair, Alexei sat by the window, watching the lights of Moscow flicker through the mist. He could hear the laughter of people in the distance, a sound he hadn't heard in years. He touched the glass, feeling its cold surface, and whispered to himself, "I'm home, but I'll never be the same." In the following weeks, he tried to rebuild. He found work at a print shop. He kept his head down, never spoke politics, never drew attention. Neighbors whispered, but no one asked questions. Sometimes, he walked by Lubyanka Square on his way to work. He would stop, stare at the massive building that had swallowed so many lives, and then keep walking, not out of courage, but out of exhaustion. And yet inside him, something had changed. He was no longer afraid of the state, or the guards, or even death. What haunted him now was memory of faces lost, voices silenced, names forgotten. Every evening he'd come home and sit with his mother. They rarely spoke of the past. But sometimes she would reach for his hand and whisper, "Thank you for coming back." And he would answer quietly. Not everyone could. Outside, Moscow began to heal. Statues fell. Truths were whispered again. But for Yelena and Alexei, healing didn't come with the new dawn. It came slowly, one moment of forgiveness at a time. Still deep within him, Alexei knew peace couldn't last. Because forgiveness, once found, has a way of being tested again. And soon, the past would come knocking. The summer of 1957 arrived with sunlight that felt almost foreign, too warm, too gentle for a city that had known so many winters of silence. For most people, it was a new beginning. But for Alexei and Yelena, the past didn't vanish with the snow. It lingered in the corners of every quiet moment. He had returned, yes. He worked, he smiled sometimes, he ate meals at the table. But something in him had stayed behind, buried in the cold soil of the north. At night, he woke up gasping, his hands clutching the blanket as if it were the chains that once bound him. He never screamed. He never spoke of what he saw there. But his eyes told stories words couldn't hold. Yelena noticed. She never asked, never pressed. Instead, she watched him the way a mother watches a candle burning too low, afraid to breathe too close and make it die. One morning, a letter arrived again, stamped and sealed, but different this time. It wasn't from the government. It was from the Committee of Rehabilitation. They wanted Alexei to come forward and testify to the injustices of the previous era. They were gathering testimonies from the victims of the purges, stories to be recorded, archived, remembered. He read it twice, then folded it carefully. "I won't go," he said simply. Yelena looked up from her sewing. "But they're trying to help, to make things right." He shook his head. "They don't want the truth, Mama. They want a story they can manage." He stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the morning light. In the camp, there were men who believed if they confessed enough, the system would forgive them. Others believed if they stayed silent, it would forget them. Both were wrong. The system doesn't remember or forgive. It just replaces. Yelena said nothing. She just nodded because deep down she knew he was right. That evening, as they ate dinner, a knock came at the door. For the first time in years, that sound didn't bring fear, only curiosity. It was a young journalist, polite, nervous, holding a notebook. "Comrade Morozov," he said, "I'm collecting stories from survivors. I was told you might be willing to talk." Alexei studied him for a long moment. The boy couldn't have been more than 20. His eyes were bright, full of the faith Alexei had lost long ago. "I don't have a story," Alexei said. The journalist hesitated. "Sir, everyone has one." "Maybe," Alexei said quietly, "but not everyone survives telling it." The journalist thanked him and left. But that night the question stayed in Alexei's mind. Was silence truly safety, or just another kind of prison? Days turned into weeks again. He continued working, reading, walking through the parks with his mother. But something restless had begun to stir inside him, the same spark that once made him speak too freely. One Sunday, he visited the old printing house where he worked. The owner, a quiet man who had known him before the war, let him use the press after hours. Alexei began to write not for the newspapers, not for the state, but for himself. Page after page, he poured out everything he had seen, the interrogations, the hunger, the men who disappeared without names, the mothers who prayed to deaf heavens. He didn't sign his name. He simply titled it The Price of Fear. When he finished, he hid the pages beneath a loose floorboard in his room. He told no one, not even his mother. But secrets have a way of finding their way to light. One afternoon while cleaning, Yelena found the pages. She sat by the window, reading line after line, tears streaming silently. Every word was a knife, but also a truth she needed to face. It was her story too. That evening she confronted him, not with anger but with trembling hands. "You wrote this." He nodded. "Why?" she whispered. "Why open the wound again?" He looked at her calm, steady, older than his years. "Because silence let them win, and I can't let them win anymore." Yelena lowered the pages, her lips quivering. "If they find this, they'll take you again." He smiled faintly. "Then they'll take me as who I am, not what they made me." She wanted to beg him to burn it, to stay quiet, to live. But for the first time since he returned, she saw something alive in his eyes, not anger, not fear, but clarity. She understood then that her son had already been broken once by fear. He wouldn't let it happen again. That night she sat awake, staring at the moonlit window. The city outside was peaceful, almost too peaceful. And she knew peace was fragile here, always had been. She prayed not for herself this time, but for him. That his truth, however dangerous, would not vanish into the same darkness that once swallowed him. But the truth never stays hidden for long. A week later, when Alexei returned home from work, the floorboard was open. The pages were gone. The evening was too quiet. That kind of quiet that doesn't belong, heavy, listening, waiting. Alexei knew something was wrong the moment he stepped through the door. His mother was sitting by the table, her hands clasped tight, eyes red but dry. On the table, a single white envelope unsealed. He froze. "Where are they?" Yelena didn't answer right away. Her lips trembled as she looked up at him. "I had to, Alex, I had to." He felt the world tilt slightly, the way it does before a fall. "You had to what?" She took a breath that broke halfway through. "I gave it to the journalist, the one who came last week." The air left his lungs. He didn't shout, he didn't even move. He just stared at her, the way a soldier stares at a wound he knows he can't stop bleeding. "You said nothing," he whispered. "I thought if they printed it, people would know. They'd understand what they did to you, what they did to all of you." Her voice cracked, raw with hope and fear tangled together. "You don't understand, Mama." Alexei's voice finally rose, sharp and shaking. "They won't let the truth live. They'll twist it, cut it, bury it. And when they come, they'll come for me." He paced the room, hands running through his hair. Yelena tried to reach for him. "I just wanted the world to hear you." He stopped and turned. His eyes burned not with anger but sorrow. "They don't hear, Mama. They only listen for what fits the story they want to tell." He sank into a chair, breathing hard. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind began to howl, carrying with it the first flakes of snow. It was as if the winter was returning to claim what the summer had borrowed. That night, neither of them slept. By morning, the knock came. 3 sharp, official raps on the door. Yelena's heart stopped. Alexei stood. His face was calm, the calm of someone who's already lived his worst day once before. 2 men in gray coats entered. No uniforms this time, just paper, pens, and cold eyes. "Comrade Morozov," one said, "we need to ask you some questions regarding an anonymous manuscript." Alexei gave a faint smile. "I'm not anonymous, am I?" The man didn't answer. He just gestured toward the door. Yelena tried to step forward. "He's done nothing wrong." One of the officers turned, almost kindly. "Madam, no one said he has. We just need clarification." They took him without cuffs, without force, as if it was a courtesy. But Yelena knew better. Courtesy was just another mask for control. When the door closed behind them, she stood still for a long time, staring at the empty chair where her son had been. The snow outside thickened, muffling the world in silence. The next morning, the Pravda newspaper ran a small, unremarkable column on page 4. A fabricated anti-state narrative has been intercepted, falsely depicting the integrity of Soviet rehabilitation efforts. The author has been detained for questioning. No name was printed, no signature. Just the phrase, "an author." Yelena read it 3 times, then folded the paper slowly, pressing it to her chest. 2 months passed. No letters came, no word from the authorities. Only silence again. But this time, Yelena wasn't afraid. She had changed. Something inside her, once timid, obedient, had begun to harden. Every week she went to the district office. Every week they told her the same thing. Investigation ongoing. Every week she said the same thing back. "I'll wait." And she did. Until one day, a stranger came, a woman in her 30s, carrying a folded copy of a foreign newspaper. "You're Alexei Morozov's mother." Yelena nodded cautiously. The woman smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "I'm from Warsaw, a friend of the journalist your son spoke with." She handed her the newspaper. The headline read, "The Price of Fear, a Soviet Survivor Speaks." It was his words, his sentences, his truth. Smuggled out, translated, printed, alive. Yelena covered her mouth, trembling. "He did it," she whispered. "He finally did it." The woman nodded. "People are reading it everywhere. Paris, Prague, London. The world knows his name now." Yelena's tears fell freely, not of grief this time, but something heavier, purer. A mother's pride wrapped in sorrow. She looked at the woman and asked softly, "Will that help him?" The woman hesitated, then said quietly, "No, but it will help others." Yelena closed her eyes, clutching the paper as if it were his hand. That winter, she began to visit the park where she once waited for him years ago. Every week she sat on the same bench with the same thermos of tea, staring at the gate just in case. People passed by, never noticing her. But in her heart, she carried something the state could never erase. A story that had escaped the cage. And sometimes, in the whisper of the cold wind, she thought she could still hear his voice. Not broken, not afraid. Just free. Decades passed. The country changed its name, its flag, its songs. The statues that once towered over Moscow squares were quietly pulled down, their faces shrouded in dust and shame. But the silence, that old familiar silence, still lingered. It had simply learned to whisper instead of roar. Yelena Morozova lived long enough to see the new dawn, but not long enough to understand it. She died in 1988, just months before the world began to speak openly again. They found her in her apartment, a cup of cold tea on the table, and beside it, a small wooden box. Inside that box was everything she had ever loved and lost. Her husband's military badge, her son's childhood drawing of a bird, and a folded clipping, that same foreign newspaper, yellowed by time, the ink faded but still legible. The Price of Fear, a Soviet Survivor Speaks. For nearly 40 years, that story had lived like a ghost, carried from one smuggled copy to another, read in whispers, quoted in exile, and then forgotten. Until one day, a young historian named Mikhail Ivanenko stumbled upon the same article in an archive in Prague. He was 28, the same age Alexei had been when the world swallowed him whole. The story fascinated him. A nameless Soviet prisoner describing life inside the camps, written with such vivid pain and clarity it felt almost personal. But what drew him most was a single line in the final paragraph. "If anyone remembers the name Morozov, tell my mother I forgive her." Mikhail froze. He had read hundreds of survivor accounts, but never one that ended like that. With forgiveness, not vengeance. He spent months searching for the truth. The archives were incomplete, files burned or sealed behind the walls of the old KGB building. But he kept digging letters, fragments, interviews with the last living witnesses. And then, one winter afternoon, he found it. A record thin and fragile as dust. Morozov Alexei Pavlovich, detained for dissemination of anti-state material. Case closed, deceased, 1957. There was no trial record, no burial site, just a date, and beside it a signature. Yelena Morozova. The same handwriting that had begun it all. Mikhail sat there for hours, staring at the page. He imagined the mother who had signed that name, the trembling hand, the justifications, the unbearable love behind the betrayal. He decided the story couldn't die again. Months later, a documentary aired on state television, The Mother Who Reported Her Son. For the first time, the Morozov name was spoken publicly. Old neighbors came forward. One remembered Yelena's kindness. Another recalled the night the agents came. And slowly, piece by piece, the silence broke. In one segment, they played a restored recording of Alexei's words, smuggled through decades of tape and dust. "We all fear the knock on the door, but the worst knock is the one that comes from your own home." The voice was thin, cracked, but alive. When the program ended, people sat in stunned quiet. Some wept. Some turned off the television and sat in the dark, unable to move. And somewhere in a small cemetery outside Moscow, under a tree that leaned like it was listening, a bouquet of carnations appeared on an unmarked grave. No name, no stone. Just a note. "You were right." The story spread across the new Russia, then beyond it. Historians wrote papers, journalists made films. But what moved people most wasn't the politics, it was the humanity. A mother who loved her son so much she destroyed him, believing she was saving him. A son who suffered but still forgave. A silence that outlived them both, and then finally broke. Years later, in 2015, Mikhail's documentary won an international award. At the ceremony, he was asked why he chose this story, out of thousands from that dark time. He paused, looked at the crowd, and said quietly, "Because this one isn't just about the past. It's about every mother who's ever feared for her child. Every person who's ever stayed silent when they should have spoken. And every voice that dares to speak, even when no one's listening." The audience rose to their feet. Some clapped, some cried. And as the lights dimmed, the old black and white photo of Alexei and Yelena filled the screen. A mother and son, frozen in a time where love and fear were inseparable. Tonight, somewhere, someone will hear this story for the first time. They'll think about their own choices, their own silences. They'll feel that quiet ache, that reminder that the cost of obedience is often greater than the cost of defiance. And maybe, just maybe, they'll whisper his name. Alexei Morozov, the son who was betrayed, and the mother who never stopped loving him. The story ends where it began, with one woman, one decision, and the sound of a pen scratching paper in a quiet Moscow apartment. Only now, the world is listening. It was a bitter Moscow evening in 1953. Snow whispered across the narrow streets, collecting in the corners of old apartment blocks. The city looked asleep, but fear was wide awake, hiding behind drawn curtains, behind the quiet of every home. Inside one of those homes, a mother sat at her table, staring at a piece of paper. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she was about to write. Her name was Yelena Morozova, 54 years old, widow seamstress. She had lived through war, famine, and the endless march of orders from above, but nothing had prepared her for this. On the wall behind her hung a small photo of her son, a proud young man in his red army uniform, smiling faintly, eyes bright with youth. His name was Alexei, 27, intelligent, outspoken, and reckless enough to believe he could speak freely in Stalin's Russia. That was his first mistake. 2 nights earlier, Alexei had come home after a long day at the factory. The radio had just played a speech praising Comrade Stalin's brilliance, and Alexei laughed. He said the speech was empty, that no man should be worshipped like a god. His mother froze. Even the walls seemed to listen. She told him to lower his voice. He only smiled, saying, "Mama, what are they going to do? Arrest me for speaking the truth?" She didn't answer, but her heart pounded with dread. Yelena had seen what happens when truth is spoken too loud. The neighbor from 2 floors down, gone in the night. Her husband questioned once and never came home. She had learned long ago that safety lived in silence. But Alexei was young, proud, and blind to the cost of defiance. That night as he went to bed, Yelena sat awake. She could hear him breathing in the next room, peaceful and unafraid. She thought of the years she had raised him alone. The nights she patched his torn school clothes, the mornings she wrapped his lunch in wax paper. She had given him everything she had, and now she might lose him. By morning, the decision had already started to form, quietly, like frost spreading on glass. When she reached the police office later that day, she didn't tell them his name at first. She simply said, "My son has been saying dangerous things." The officer behind the desk didn't look surprised. He just nodded, slid a blank sheet of paper toward her and said softly, "Write it down." The sound of the pen scratching the paper felt louder than her heartbeat. Every word she wrote was a blade, a confession, an act of betrayal, and a plea for mercy all at once. She told herself she was protecting him. She told herself that if she reported him, they would simply warn him, that maybe it would end there. She told herself, a lie she needed to believe. When she finally handed over the paper, the officer folded it, stamped it, and said, "We'll take care of it." Just like that. No comfort, no questions. And in that moment, something inside Yelena broke quietly, like the snapping of a thread. That evening when Alexei came home, she made him soup. She asked about his day. He smiled, told her the factory was cold, the work endless. He had no idea what was coming. But Yelena couldn't look at him the same way. Every glance was heavy with guilt. Every word she spoke felt like a countdown. 3 days later, the knock came. 2 men in long coats, no emotion, no words wasted. Alexei didn't fight. He didn't even ask why. He just turned to his mother and searched her face for understanding, for answers, for mercy. But she couldn't speak. She stood frozen as they took him away. And when the door closed, silence returned to the apartment. Except for the faint echo of boots on the stairwell, fading into nothing. That night, Yelena sat at the same table, staring at the empty bowl of soup he hadn't finished. The snow outside kept falling, soft and endless. And she whispered to herself, "I saved him. I had to save him." But somewhere deep inside, she already knew. The KGB didn't warn. They erased. And her son was already gone. The van rumbled through the frozen streets of Moscow, its metal walls echoing every turn, every stop. Inside, Alexei sat between 2 officers, silent, rigid, his breath fogging the cold air. He didn't ask where they were taking him. He already knew. The KGB headquarters stood like a shadow at the heart of the city, a fortress built of stone and secrets. Lubyanka. For years, Alexei had walked past it on his way to work. Now, he was walking into it. They led him through narrow corridors that smelled of ink and damp concrete. Doors lined the hall, each one whispering the same story people brought in, never seen again. When they finally stopped, the officer opened a door and motioned him inside. A single table, 2 chairs, a light hanging low from the ceiling. Across from him sat a man in a gray suit, thin, sharp-faced, eyes too calm. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. He simply opened a file, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Comrade Alexei Morozov, your mother has reported you." The words struck like a hammer. Alexei blinked, unsure he'd heard right. "My mother." The officer didn't look up. "She wrote that you've been making anti-Soviet remarks, that you mocked Comrade Stalin's leadership, that you're spreading ideas harmful to the people." Alexei shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping before he could stop it. "She must have misunderstood. My mother, she wouldn't." The officer finally raised his eyes, cold, unreadable. "She's a loyal citizen. You should be proud of her." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Alexei leaned back, the chair creaking under him. He could see his mother's face in his mind, tired, kind, loving, but now twisted by confusion. Why would she do this? Why? The officer lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward like a slow, deliberate ghost. "Tell me, Alexei," he said softly, "do you believe Comrade Stalin is infallible?" Alexei hesitated. "He's done much for our country." "That's not what I asked." Silence. The light flickered. "I asked if you believe he can make mistakes." Alexei's throat tightened. Every word from here was a step on thin ice. He could lie. He could say, yes, the leader is perfect. That would end it. But something deep inside him refused. He swallowed hard. Everyone can make mistakes. The officer's pen scratched across the paper. "Everyone," he repeated quietly, "even the leader." A door opened somewhere down the hall. Shouts. A woman sobs. Then the sound of boots, fast, heavy, final. Alexei's heart raced. He wanted to scream, to run, to beg. But all he could do was sit there, waiting for the next question. The officer leaned forward. "You seem intelligent, idealistic. Tell me, what do you want for the Soviet Union?" "A better future," Alexei said. "A future without fear." The officer smiled faintly. "Fear is necessary. Fear keeps the people loyal. Without it, we have chaos." He stood, walked around the table, and placed a hand on Alexei's shoulder. "You'll stay with us for a few days, just to clear things up." A few days. Those words echoed in Alexei's mind as they led him away. But in the Soviet Union, a few days could mean forever. Back in her apartment, Yelena sat by the window, the curtains half open. She hadn't slept since they took him. Every creak in the hallway made her flinch. Every knock from the neighbors sent her heart racing. She told herself she had done the right thing, that they would question him, correct him, bring him home safe. But the hours stretched into days, the days into weeks. And there was no word. She went to the local office once, asking quietly if her son would be released. The clerk gave her a look of pity, the kind reserved for the doomed. "We'll inform you when there's news," he said, already turning to the next person in line. She walked home through the snow, her legs trembling, her heart hollow. Every mother in Moscow knew what "will inform you" meant. At night, she sat by the table again, staring at the empty chair across from her. The same chair where her son used to sit, laughing, teasing her about burning the soup. Now there was only silence. And then one evening, a small envelope arrived. No return address, no name, just a red stamp, Lubyanka. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a short note, typed neatly, without emotion. "Comrade Alexei Morozov is under investigation for anti-state activity. Do not attempt contact." No signature, no date. That was all. Yelena folded the paper carefully, placed it in a drawer and closed it. As if by hiding it, she could hide what she had done. Outside, Moscow's streets glowed faintly under the winter moon. People hurried home, heads down, afraid of being noticed. And somewhere, deep inside the stone belly of Lubyanka, her son sat in a cold cell, replaying her face in his mind, again and again, trying to understand how love could become betrayal. He didn't know it yet, but his interrogation had only just begun. Days became a blur inside Lubyanka. There was no sunrise, no sunset, only light and darkness traded by the guards' footsteps. Alexei lost count of time. Meals arrived at random. Sleep came only when exhaustion finally broke him. The cell was narrow, with walls that wept moisture. He had no bed, just a wooden plank, a thin blanket, and the echo of his own breath. He tried to tell himself this was temporary, that someone would realize the mistake, that his mother hadn't meant it. But every night, that hope faded a little more. He wasn't alone. In the next cell, he could sometimes hear voices, whispers traded between prisoners when the guards weren't near. One voice belonged to an old professor, another to a young poet. Each had been brought here for words, not weapons. For thoughts, not crimes. And each of them waited for the same thing, a chance to confess to something they didn't believe, to survive another day. When they came for him again, he was too weak to protest. 2 guards, the same gray-suited officer, the same table, the same light that never stopped glaring down like an unblinking eye. The officer didn't greet him this time. He just placed a file on the desk, thicker now, heavier, and opened it. "Your mother has been cooperative," he said calmly. "She told us you've spoken against the party before." Alexei froze. She said that. The officer nodded. "You questioned the victories of the great patriotic war. You mocked the speeches of the leader. You even suggested the people live in fear." Alexei's throat closed. He wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that his mother would never say those things. But the words wouldn't come. He realized then it didn't matter what was true. It only mattered what was written. The officer leaned forward. "Comrade Morozov, let's not make this harder. Everyone makes mistakes. A written confession will help you. You're still young. The state can forgive." Forgive. The word sounded almost kind, like a trick. He stared at the paper placed in front of him. Blank except for the header, Statement of Admission. The pen rested beside it, waiting. For hours, the room stayed silent. Only the faint ticking of a clock filled the space between them. Finally, Alexei spoke. "If I sign this, what happens?" "You'll be transferred, re-educated, maybe even released," the officer said. His tone was smooth, rehearsed. Alexei knew it was a lie, but he also knew the truth wouldn't save him either. He thought of his mother, her trembling hands, her quiet prayers, her tired eyes. Maybe if he signed, she'd be left alone. Maybe that was enough. He picked up the pen. His fingers shook. The ink bled across the paper as he wrote. "I, Alexei Ivanovich Morozov, confess to speaking against the Soviet state and its leadership." Each word burned. Each word stole a piece of him. When it was done, the officer took the paper, scanned it briefly, and smiled faintly. "Well done, comrade. Truth brings peace." He nodded to the guards, and they led Alexei out, not to his cell, but down a darker corridor. That corridor smelled of iron and despair. The walls bore stains that never washed away. He heard screams echoing from somewhere far below. Not sharp, but hollow, the kind that came from souls already broken. He wasn't taken there that night. Instead, they locked him in a smaller cell, isolated, silent. Hours passed, maybe days. He began to talk to himself, to stay sane, to feel alive. He recited poems, whispered prayers he hadn't said since childhood. And sometimes in the darkness, he thought he could hear his mother's voice, soft, gentle, saying his name. Meanwhile, back in her apartment, Yelena sat by the window again, sewing under the dim light. She had stopped asking questions. Every morning she walked to the market, nodded at neighbors who avoided her eyes, then returned home to the same empty silence. But one afternoon, as she stood in line for bread, she overheard two women whispering about a group of men taken from Lubyanka to a labor camp near Norilsk. Her heart sank. She didn't know if Alexei was among them, but the thought alone crushed her. That night she pulled out the drawer, the one where she'd hidden the letter, and read it again. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to speak the truth aloud. "I've killed my own son. No one heard. No one was meant to." In that moment, she realized something the state would never print on any poster. Fear doesn't just control you. It convinces you to destroy what you love most. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she began to hope. Hope that maybe her son was still alive. That maybe, by some miracle, she would see him again. But hope was a dangerous thing in Moscow. Because the KGB had other plans for Alexei Morozov. The train screeched through the Siberian wilderness, its wheels grinding against frozen steel. Inside one of its dark wooden wagons, Alexei sat chained among dozens of other prisoners, men hollowed by hunger and silence. The air was heavy with sweat, smoke, and fear. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Everyone knew where they were going. The train carried no name, no destination written on its side. But every man inside knew. The word whispered in fear for decades: Gulag. When the doors finally slid open, the prisoners were greeted not by guards shouting, but by the wind, sharp and merciless. Snow stretched in every direction. Beyond it, barracks stood like ghosts against a white horizon. A wooden sign swayed in the wind. Camp 47. The guards yelled for them to move. Alexei stumbled out, his boots sinking into the snow. He hadn't felt sunlight in months, but here it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like exposure, like the sky itself was watching. They were stripped, searched, and handed worn uniforms that smelled of damp and earth. Numbers replaced names. Alexei became prisoner 1729. Every day followed the same rhythm: the whistle before dawn, the march to the worksite, the swing of pickaxes against frozen ground. They built roads that led nowhere, mined stone no one needed, worked for a purpose no one would ever explain. The guards didn't shout much. They didn't need to. Hunger did the shouting, cold did the punishing. Among the prisoners was an old historian named Petrov. Thin, frail, his hands shaking even when he was still. He had been in the camp for 10 years. He told Alexei that time here didn't move forward, it folded in on itself, day after day, until men forgot what they were waiting for. "Don't think too much," Petrov whispered one night. "Thinking is dangerous here. Remember your name, that's all you must not lose." But it was already happening. Names faded, faces blurred. The past began to feel like a dream Alexei had once lived, soft, distant, fatting. Sometimes at night he thought of his mother. He imagined her sewing by the window, humming an old tune. He wanted to hate her. He tried to, but he couldn't. Because deep down he knew she hadn't done it out of cruelty. She had done it out of fear. And fear, he realized, was the true ruler of their world. Winter came harder that year. The temperature dropped below. Frostbite took fingers, then hands. Men slept side by side, clinging to warmth that was never enough. Every morning, the guards dragged out those who hadn't made it through the night. They didn't say names, they just counted bodies. One morning, Petrov didn't wake. Alexei sat beside him in silence, staring at the old man's frozen face. He wanted to close his eyes, but the guards didn't allow it. They took the body away before sunrise. That night, Alexei didn't sleep. He stared through the cracks of the barrack wall at the sky, black, endless, silent. And for the first time since his arrest, he whispered a prayer. Not to Stalin, not to the state, but to his mother. Forgive me, Mama, for making you afraid. Back in Moscow, Yelena grew thinner by the week. Her eyes had lost their light. The neighbors stopped speaking to her. They feared even her grief might be contagious. She avoided the mirror. She couldn't bear to see the woman who had written that letter. Then one morning, a postcard arrived. It was small, worn, the ink fading, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. Mama, I am alive. Do not worry for me. The place is cold, but I am strong. Remember our garden. I think of it every night. Take care of yourself. Your son, Alexei. The words were short, careful, clearly censored, but they were his. She pressed the card to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. For the first time in months, she smiled. She didn't know that prisoners were forced to write those letters, that each one was dictated, inspected, rewritten until it fit the image the state wanted families to see. Still, it gave her something to live for. Every morning she'd read it again, trace his name, whisper his words. And though part of her knew it might not be true, she chose to believe. Meanwhile in Camp 47, Alexei's days blended into years. His hair turned gray at the edges, his hands rough and scarred. He no longer dreamed of Moscow. It felt like another lifetime. But one evening, as he watched the sun set through the barbed wire, he felt something strange, something he hadn't felt in years. Calm. The sky above the Siberian plain burned orange and violet, endless and pure. And in that moment, Alexei understood something his mother never had. You can imprison a body, but you cannot imprison what refuses to surrender inside it. When night came, and the frost closed around the camp like a fist, Alexei closed his eyes and whispered again, Mama, I forgive you. What he didn't know was that his forgiveness would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. Because in Moscow, a letter with his name on it had just reached his mother's door. And it would change everything.